Hello and welcome back to Bookish, and welcome back to day 3 of Tagapalooza. This week I'm spending this week trying to catch up on all my tags so I can go into next week with no tags still to do. So this is the third of what will now be 5 tags because I was tagged this week, which I always appreciate. I don't want to give you the impression that I don't like it, but I've kind of made up my mind to get all these tags done, so I'm going to do 5 this week, a video on Friday, and then once again burden you with my presence, I suppose, on Saturday as well for the normal Saturday video, I think. Anyway, so this is the third tag. This is a tag created by Sean the Book Maniac, but in his video he makes it clear that he was inspired by a video done by Eric Carl Anderson, and that video was basically a video about good books with bad endings. Eric Carl Anderson didn't make it into a tag, but Sean saw it and thought it would make a good tag. And I agree. It is a good tag, an interesting tag, which gets us a look at some books that we maybe liked, but we thought the endings kind of let the book down. I watched Marc Nash's version of this video this morning, and I have a tendency to agree with him. There are a lot of books which I think are good, which I think in the end kind of let me down. So I have 4 books I want to talk about, and the ending of these 4 books were disappointing for me. Even though I was enjoying the books, in some cases, even though I was enjoying the books very much, and I have to be clear when I say the endings were disappointing. They didn't ruin the book. I still think all of these books were good books and books that I enjoyed reading, but the endings were just a little off. So the first one I want to mention is, believe it or not, Far from the Madding Crowd by Thomas Hardy. If you've watched my channel for any length of time, you know I have serious issues with Thomas Hardy. However, of all the Hardy books, that makes sense, I'm talking about the Hardy Boys. Of all the Thomas Hardy books I've read, this is easily my favorite. It's easily the one I like the best, and that's because I like the character at the center of this, Bathsheba Everdeen. I like her a lot. Essentially, she inherits a farm. I'm going to call it a farm. She moves in. She's going to run it herself. She becomes kind of the focus of a lot of romantic interest, not the least of which from a young, hardworking, honest, good-hearted shepherd in the beginning named Gabriel Oakes, but also from kind of a town scion, a wealthy man in town who she kind of mistakenly attracts the attention of, and then kind of a rape character in the form of Captain Troy. And she's kind of at the center of all these men who at various times are competing for her attention. But throughout the novel, and one of the things I think makes the novel extraordinary and good is that for the time period it's in, you know, Bathsheba Everdeen is an incredibly independent, capable person. And you get the impression she could have gone on, you know, running this farm and being a business person all by herself. And in the end, I found myself rooting for that to happen. And so, you know, when she does, in the end, choose, I won't spoil it. I watch a lot of spoiler tags today, and so I'm going to irritate people who don't care about spoilers, I suppose, but I won't spoil it. But in the end, when she chooses someone to marry, I was just disappointed that she didn't just continue on as an independent, unmarried woman who maybe, you know, just dated these guys. Maybe that's too, I'm sure there's too modern a concept, perhaps, for 19th century British readers, but that's kind of what I wanted. So I found that disappointing. I also want to mention that the end of The Deerslayer by James Fenimore Cooper disappointed me. This is one of Cooper's Leatherstocking tales, which includes like The Pioneers and The Last of the Mohicans. And The Deerslayer I read before BookTube. I read this book because I oftentimes talked about James Fenimore Cooper in a negative way. And I thought, you know, you should read another book besides Last of the Mohicans. That's how I chose The Deerslayer. So this book involves, you know, Cooper's hero of the Leatherstocking tales, a man named Natty Bumppo, who in this one is the Deerslayer. And Natty Bumppo and an acquaintance who's known as Hurry Harry, who is essentially Natty Bumppo's exact opposite in terms of moral character and view of Native Americans, etc. They are headed out to a lake. In the book, the lake is called Lake Glimmermere, and they're going to meet up with a man who owns, has built essentially a house in the middle of the lake. They meet him. He has two daughters. There are various exchanges with Native Americans, which don't depict the Native Americans in a correct way for modern times, but which Cooper does display some sympathy for in the book. And in the end, the man who they're going to meet up on the island, he has two daughters, and one of them kind of falls in love with Natty Bumppo, and Natty Bumppo, the deer slayer, rejects her because she's not pure enough for him. And he's the pure, good-hearted hero who always does the right thing, and he can't bring himself to be with a woman who's has a, let's say, a somewhat checkered past with Hurry Harry and perhaps with some English officers from a nearby fort who she's met because of the business that her dad is in. That's a simplification of the plot. That was just so irritating and so disappointing. And I understand why it had to take place. There's this kind of cheesy, perfect hero stuff that Natty Bumppo is supposed to be, but also the Deerslayer is actually kind of like the prequel to the other Leather Stocking Tales in which Natty Bumppo appears, and if he were to be married, it kind of would have thrown off what Cooper had already written. He actually wrote this book after the other Leather Stocking Tales as a prequel, so he can't very well have Natty Bumppo get married, but it was so disappointing that Natty Bumppo had kind of won the love of a really lovely person whose life had not been particularly easy, and he rejects her because she's not pure enough for him. It's just really irritating and disappointing. So there are those two, and that's a certain kind of disappointment. And I like both those books. I didn't necessarily think either one was great. That's not true of Wallace Stegner's Angle of Repose. And let me make it clear to you, I think this book is very, very good. I enjoyed it. It's beautifully written. The scenes are beautifully described. The characters are beautifully developed. I think the book is very good to great. So this is not a negative review of the book, because the book, for the most part, is just really, really good. Really, really great. It is a historical fiction with a framing story. The framing story is that in what would have been the present day when the book was written, which is the 1970s, a grandson is writing essentially the story or a novel about his grandmother and grandfather and their relationship and lives together in the American West in the historical past. And through that, we learn that the grandmother is an incredibly driven, hard-headed, knows what she wants, but somehow she marries a man who wants things that seem to be completely different from her. This leads to tension and problems. It leads to ruined relationships and difficult generations that come after that. But the framing story part is where I have the problem. The man, the grandson writing the book, has a degenerative disease, which is basically causing him to lose the ability to move around, and he is confined to a wheelchair. And there's just this incredibly weird scene at the end of the book between the man, the character, the grandson writing the novel, and the daughter of a woman who's been taking care of him, which has, well, I'm just not going to go any further than that. It's just really, really weird, and it really, I don't see why that's a part of the book at all. I couldn't make a connection between it and what went on in the rest of the book and the story. And so it had what I think is a weird, bad, disappointing ending to a very good book. And the last book I want to talk about is Michael Ondaatje's Warlight. I think this is his latest novel. Oh. This is his latest novel, and the novel is set during World War II. A boy and his older sister find themselves abandoned by their two parents in wartime London and left in the care of a really interesting character who has really interesting friends, and their lives kind of fall apart to a certain extent. They make new adjustments in a life essentially without parents, with no idea of where their parents went or what's happened to them, and they make their own lives, and they get involved with what's going on with their caretaker and his friends. And it's really interesting, and it's really well drawn. I think it's really well written, and I think that part of the story in the book is really good. A little confusing, really good. You know, that it's interesting, the places where he places his main character, who's the young man, and what he has him do and what kind of problems he shows him having. Near the end of the book, we see the young man as a grown-up who is working in a government office which gives him access to secret files from World War II, and he learns essentially that his mother and father were not really necessarily in love, and that his mother was a master spy, spying on the enemy during World War II, and he learns all this stuff, and he ends up moving into the house where she lived when she died and meeting the people around, and he learns a lot of stuff about her, but there's only so much you can learn about what your mom was actually up to from a set of government files. And so the disappointing part to me, or one of the two disappointing parts to me at the end, was that in the end he lays down on the bed, on his mother's bed, after she's been dead for a while. He lays down on his mother's bed, and all of a sudden we are in his mother's mind, seeing what went on kind of near the end of her life, and we get her thoughts as though the young man is channeling his mother's spirit because he lay on the bed, which I found that to be strained. I felt like that to a certain extent Ondaatje had written himself into a corner. He had this really interesting character and he had a story he wanted to be able to tell us about her, but he'd written himself in a position where he couldn't tell the story without something almost mystical happen. And then even worse, the young man becomes reacquainted with some of the people, particularly a young lady that he met during this time where he was a young man in London living under the care of this strange guardian that he has. And there is an incredibly predictable and hokey, cheesy resolution to their story, which really came close to ruining the novel for me. Anyway, so there you go. Those are the four good books that I read that had disappointing endings. I'm not going to tag anybody because Sean tagged about 1 million people, but this is one of those tags where if you watch this and you have like some books you want to share that you think had disappointing endings, please do the tag. Look forward to your comments in the comment section below, and as always, thank you for watching.